They laughed when the veteran and his dog dug into the frozen ground. But no one was laughing when the entire valley began freezing to death. When the brutal Montana winter came crashing down, the town mocked Luke Harrison for building a crazy underground hideout with his loyal dog, Ranger. But as temperatures plunged and homes turned to ice, one hidden room beneath a barn became the only warm place for miles. And the truth no one expected finally rose to the surface. The wind cut across the wide Montana plains like a cold knife, carrying the sharp scent of pine and winter, even though the calendar still claimed it was early fall. Luke Harrison paused long enough to pull his flannel collar higher against his neck before returning to the loose board beneath his boots. The old barn had stood here for decades, long before he bought the property, and every beam, nail, and plank seemed to carry a memory that wasn't his. He didn't mind that. In some strange way, it felt easier to live with a stranger's ghosts than the ones he'd brought back from 12 years of military service. The land was quiet, predictable, peaceful most days. Ranger padded beside him, the German shepherd's ears perked high, eyes scanning the shadows as if the barn were another battlefield to secure. Luke chuckled under his breath. "Relax, buddy. It's just rotten wood, not a perimeter breach." But Ranger didn't relax. He sniffed the air, muscles tensing, and issued a low growl deep in his chest. Luke crouched beside the damaged corner, hammer in hand. The plank he planned to replace was thin as paper and soft from years of damp hay resting over it. He set the new board aside, bracing himself to remove the old one. Before he could wedge the claw of the hammer beneath it, Ranger lunged forward. The sudden burst of barking echoed off the barn walls, loud and sharp enough to startle Luke backward onto one knee. Ranger clawed at the board, paws scraping as if he were trying to dig something out. Something alive, something dangerous. "Whoa, hey." Luke grabbed the dog's harness, but Ranger refused to budge. His bark shifted into a frantic, urgent tempo Luke had only heard twice before. Once during a night raid overseas, and once when Ranger saved him from stepping onto a hidden pit trap in enemy territory. That sound made Luke's pulse quicken. "Ranger, what is it?" he whispered. The dog slammed his weight forward. The old plank snapped. Before Luke could stand fully, the entire section of flooring gave way beneath him. His left boot plunged downward, swallowed up to the knee by empty space. Splintered wood scraped his shin as he gasped and caught himself on the neighboring boards, breath punching out of his lungs. For a moment, everything was silent, except Ranger's panting. Luke steadied himself, heart thundering in his chest. Carefully, he pulled his leg free, sliding backward onto solid floor. He reached for his flashlight, clipped to his belt, snapped it on, and angled it toward the jagged opening. The beam cut through the dust and darkness and revealed something impossible. Below him was not loose soil, not a collapsed animal den, not the remnants of an old root cellar. No, this was a room, a carved-out chamber, rectangular and deep, maybe 10 feet long and nearly as wide. Smooth walls formed from packed earth, reinforced with wooden beams. The floor down there wasn't mud either. It was firm, almost polished, like someone had lived or worked in the space for years. Luke blinked hard, wondering if his mind was filling in details out of habit. Tunnels, hideouts, weapon stashes, those belonged to another lifetime. But this was no hallucination. This was real. He lowered the flashlight through the opening. Shadows shifted and lifted, revealing a small iron stove tucked in the far left corner. Its square mouth was closed, the handle still intact. Above it, a vent pipe disappeared into the boards, disguised perfectly within the barn's outer wall structure. If Luke hadn't seen it from below, he never would have noticed. Someone built this on purpose. Someone hid it and someone used it long enough to build a stove, camouflage the vent, and ensure no one ever knew. A chill slid up Luke's spine, not from the Montana wind, but from the quiet truth staring back at him from the dark. Secrets lived here, deep ones. He set the flashlight down, leaned closer, and tried to steady his breathing. Ranger hovered beside him, tail stiff, ears pricked, pupils wide with focus. The dog sensed something. Danger, a presence, or maybe just the unknown buried beneath their feet for who knew how many decades. Luke took in a slow breath. "Well, Ranger," he murmured. "Looks like this place has a story we didn't pay for." The dog whined softly, nudging Luke's elbow, urging him to act. But even Ranger didn't dare step closer to the broken edge. Luke swallowed hard and stared into the hidden chamber below, feeling a familiar surge of adrenaline he wished he'd left behind on foreign soil. Whatever this place was, it wasn't part of the listing, and it sure wasn't normal. But something in his gut, something old, instinctive, military, told him this discovery was not an accident. It was the beginning. "Let's find out what's down there," he whispered. Ranger didn't bark this time. He simply stood guard at Luke's side, steady and silent as the wind outside shifted, carrying the first whisper of winter through the cracks of the barn. Luke eased himself closer to the broken floor's edge, brushing aside splintered wood and stray hay. The hole yawned wider now that the board had collapsed, revealing more of the chamber below. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beam of his flashlight, like tiny ghosts rising from their long slumber. Ranger sniffed the air again, every muscle in his body tight, his instinct sharper than any weapon Luke had ever carried. Luke steadied the flashlight in his left hand and tested the edge of the floor with his right. It held but just barely. A few more inches and he would have crashed straight through when the board gave way earlier. He exhaled slowly, thanking whatever luck he still had left. "Could have broken my neck," he muttered under his breath. He angled the flashlight deeper into the chamber. The walls weren't rough or sloppy the way an animal burrow would be. They were carefully shaped, reinforced with layers of sod bricks packed tightly with clay. Wooden beams, weathered but still solid, spanned across the ceiling, supporting the barn floor above. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. This wasn't improvisation, this was craftsmanship. A faint chill rolled up from the chamber, but it wasn't the damp, cold Luke expected from a buried room. Instead, it felt dry, almost preserved, like the air hadn't shifted in years. He spotted a small ladder in the shadows leaning against the dirt wall. Its rungs were dusty but intact. "Well, that's convenient," he murmured. He tugged at it from above to test its strength. The wood creaked, but it didn't crumble. He slipped his flashlight into his mouth, gripping it between his teeth, and lowered himself down, rung by rung. Ranger hovered at the edge, ears turning with every creak as if ready to leap in after him if anything happened. When Luke's boots hit the packed dirt floor, a hollow thump echoed in the space around him. He lifted the flashlight. The chamber stretched out clearly now, about 10 by 8 feet. The ceiling only a little above his head. The dirt walls held firm, smooth from deliberate shaping. The place felt old, but not neglected. Dusty, yes, abandoned, obviously, but not fallen apart. He walked toward the small iron stove, each step measured. The stove was about a third the size of a normal one, squat and heavy. He touched the handle. It moved smoothly, too smoothly, for something untouched for decades. Someone must have oiled it, or at least used it long enough for the metal to stay workable. Above him, Ranger let out one short, cautious bark. "I'm fine," Luke called up softly, "just looking." He turned and swept the beam across the room again. In the far corner sat an overturned crate. He nudged it upright with his boot, empty. Another crate leaned against the wall, also empty, but beside it lay a flattened piece of cloth stiff with age. Maybe an old bedroll. Maybe someone's last attempt at comfort in this hidden space. Luke crouched and picked it up. It cracked at the seams, shedding tiny flakes of dried fabric. He ran his fingers along it anyway, trying to imagine who once slept here, and why they chose the earth instead of a bed above ground. People only hid themselves away like this for 2 reasons: fear or survival. He'd seen both firsthand. His stomach tightened. Places like this triggered a special kind of memory he didn't willingly revisit. Nights in makeshift shelters far from base, air so cold it felt like knives, darkness thick as tar, every sound louder than it should be, every breath an awareness of danger. He shook the thought away. Whoever built this, they had to be desperate. He stood and traced the pipe connected to the stove. It ran straight upward through the earth, disappearing into the barn's outer wall, camouflaged perfectly as a standard ventilation slat. A clever trick. No one would ever think smoke was coming from beneath the building. No one would suspect anything at all. Luke stepped back and studied the room again, assessing it the same way he assessed structures in the field. Entries, exits, ventilation, possible cave-ins. The place was sturdy, warmable, hidden, usable. His mind started turning without permission, calculating possibilities. Montana winters were brutal. The farmhouse's insulation was older than he was, and the heater barely worked. Firewood prices had doubled since last year, and he didn't have the savings to cover a full season's worth. This room, this little pocket under the barn, might be nothing more than a relic someone forgot to bury. But with some work, it could be a lifeline. Ranger barked again, sharper this time. Luke glanced up. "I'm coming." He climbed back up the ladder and hauled himself through the opening. Ranger immediately pressed against him, sniffing his jacket and hands like confirming he was intact. Luke rubbed the dog's head. "You saved my hide again, pal." He stood and stared at the broken plank, the dark hole yawning beneath it. A cold wind seeped through the barn's walls, whispering winter's warning. Snow hadn't arrived yet, but the temperature had dropped enough that each breath felt like an announcement. Time's running out. Luke looked down at Ranger. Ranger looked back, tail low but steady, eyes bright with instinctive understanding. "This wasn't just some accident," Luke murmured. "You found something you were meant to find." Ranger responded with a quiet whine, brushing his head against Luke's knee. Luke let out a slow breath, thinking of bills stacked on the kitchen table, the failing heater, the thin woodpile behind the house, the long nights that would soon settle across the valley. This dugout, this forgotten room, held answers he didn't know he needed. And for the first time since leaving the service, he didn't feel unlucky. He felt guided. "Come on," he said softly. "We have a lot of work to do." Ranger followed him out of the barn as the last light of day faded into the cold Montana dusk, and the hidden chamber beneath the earth waited quietly, ready to change their winter before it even began. The following morning broke with a pale sun, the kind that barely warmed the frost clinging to the fence posts. Luke stepped out onto the porch, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. He hadn't slept well. His mind kept replaying the image of that dugout beneath the barn. Those clean lines in the dirt walls, the stovepipe threaded with purpose, the eerie sense that someone had put their whole winter survival into that space. Whoever they were, they understood the cold, and they understood hiding from it. Ranger nudged the door with his nose, tail wagging low. "You want to go with me?" Luke asked. Ranger gave a short, sharp bark. His version of a firm yes. Luke grabbed his coat, slid his gloves into his pocket, and locked the cabin door behind him. They headed toward town, a 15-minute drive on a road that wound through open fields of brittle grass. Snow still hadn't arrived, but the world felt frozen in anticipation. Winter was stretching its fingers. Luke parked outside Jensen's General Store, the only place in a 20-mile radius where you could buy anything from nails to canned beans. He opened the truck door and stepped out, the cold biting through his jeans. Ranger hopped down beside him, sniffing the air with alert curiosity. Inside, the store was warm, the kind of warm that felt like stepping into someone's living room. A few locals stood near the counter, coffees in hand, voices low in the morning quiet. Luke grabbed 2 small bundles of firewood, nothing more than what he needed for the next couple of days. Money was tight, every dollar mattered. He carried the bundles to the counter and set them down. The bell above the door jingled behind him as someone walked in. "Well, would you look at that?" A familiar voice draw. "Harrison, buying enough wood to roast a marshmallow planning on a cozy December? Are you?" Luke didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Evan Mills, broad-shouldered, heavy-handed, and loud enough to stir the dust off the store rafters. Ranger stiffened immediately, eyes locked on Evan. Luke kept his tone steady. "Morning, Evan." "Morning," Evan repeated with a smug grin, stepping beside him. "Hope that little pile of sticks is enough to keep you warm when the snow hits. Heard the forecast says this winter is going to be a mean one." The other men chuckled. "Not cruel, just in that small-town way of someone watching entertainment walk through the front door." Evan leaned his elbow on the counter. "You know, Harrison, folks around here usually stock up on cords of wood, not kindling." Luke felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the one he'd spent years learning to breathe through. He didn't like crowds behind him, didn't like raised voices, didn't like being the point of attention he didn't ask for. Ranger stepped closer, brushing against his leg in a quiet reassurance. "I'll manage," Luke said softly. Evan scoffed. "Sure you will. Dog like that probably needs more heat than you bought here." He nodded at Ranger. The shepherd didn't growl, but his stare was unflinching. A soldier dog sizing up someone who had never been in the dirt with him. Luke lifted the bundles onto his arm. "We're fine." Evan raised an eyebrow. "Well, Don't say we didn't warn you when your pipes burst and you're chiseling ice out of your own sink. More laughter. Luke nodded politely to the clerk, paid and headed for the door. Ranger paced silently at his side. He felt all the eyes at his back. He felt the familiar prick of judgment, a prick he'd lived with in one way or another ever since returning home. People meant well, most of them. But folks like Evan, they didn't understand what it was like to build your life again, piece by piece, quietly, without asking anyone for anything. Don't take it personal, the clerk murmured as Luke picked up his change. Evan talks more than he thinks. Luke gave a small smile. I've noticed. He stepped outside into the cold again. Ranger hopped into the truck, tail thumping lightly against the seat. Luke set the wood in the passenger footwell and rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment. Don't let it get to you, he whispered, not sure if he was talking to himself or the dog. Ranger nudged his shoulder the same way he'd done in desert tents and mountain outposts, reminding him he wasn't alone. As they drove home, Luke's mind replayed the mocking laughter, the looks, the warnings. The town already thought he wasn't prepared. If he let words slip about that dugout, about the strange room buried beneath his barn, they'd have a field day with him. Crazy soldier living underground. PTSD, bunker boy. He'd heard worse overseas. But here, the hurt came from a quieter place, a place inside him he rarely let anyone see. When he pulled back into his property, Ranger jumped out first, eager to run across the yard. Luke stepped out more slowly, gazing at the barn. The dugout was there, waiting beneath the floorboards, untouched for who knew how long, as if it had waited for the right person. Let them laugh, he murmured. We'll figure this out. The wind picked up again, colder now than when the sun rose. Luke felt it, felt winter pressing at the edges of the valley, creeping closer, whispering a warning only he seemed to hear. He looked down at the 2 bundles of wood in his arms. It wouldn't be enough, not even close. But the dugout might change that if he played this smart, if he kept quiet. If no one found out before he was ready. Ranger trotted back to his side, tail wagging gently, eyes bright with trust. Luke reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head. We'll manage, he repeated. But this time, the words didn't feel stubborn. They felt like a promise built not on what he'd bought that morning, but on what Ranger had found the night before. A hidden room, a forgotten secret, and maybe a way to survive the winter no one expected. The thought followed Luke like a shadow for the rest of the day. Even as he stacked the small bundles of firewood beside the porch, his eyes drifted toward the barn again and again, drawn to the hidden opening beneath the old boards. The air felt colder than it should have for early fall, the kind of cold that seeped into bone and memory, stirring up fears he thought he had buried overseas. Ranger paced the yard, nose to the wind, tail swaying in a slow, thoughtful motion. Every few minutes, he glanced back at Luke as if he sensed the weight pressing down on his shoulders. The dog's instincts were razor sharp, sharper sometimes than Luke's own sense of danger. Ranger always knew when a turning point had arrived. Luke brushed the dust from his gloves and took a step toward the barn. Let's check it again, he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he meant the dugout or his own resolve. Ranger fell in beside him, matching pace, ears perked as though returning to a mission briefing. Inside, the barn was colder than the house. The wind wormed its way through gaps in the boards, carrying the scent of dry hay and northern pine. Luke knelt beside the broken plank, lifted the lantern he brought with him, and lowered its light toward the opening. The dugout glowed faintly beneath him, earth walls, wooden beams, iron stove, silent, waiting. The place had a strange presence, as if the earth itself had shaped it for survival. Luke climbed down the ladder once more, Ranger leaning over the hole to watch him descend. The air inside the chamber was even colder than before, yet it held a dryness that belonged to a space meant for warmth, not storage. He placed the lantern on the floor and walked the perimeter of the room again. No mold, no collapse. The vent pipe above looked sturdy, protected by the barn's wallboards. Whoever had built this dugout built it with intention. Someone lived down here, Luke whispered, brushing his fingers along a packed earth seam. Someone survived a winter like this. The lantern crackled lightly. Ranger whined from above, urging him to speak or act, anything other than getting lost in the silence. Luke's breath fogged in the dim light as he sat on the overturned crate. He wiped his palms against his pants, staring at the iron stove. He imagined feeding it a handful of wood on a freezing night and watching warmth fill this tight, well-insulated space while the world above froze stiff. How much wood would it take? A quarter of what he needed in the cabin? Maybe a fifth? Thoughts spun into calculations. He pictured the wood racks in town, the prices printed on the chalkboard outside Jensen's, the thin stack sitting behind his house right now. It wouldn't last a month. Not with the winter the forecast was whispering about. This room forgotten but waiting. It could save him. It could save Ranger. But the moment he told anyone about it, Evan Mills or the men gathered at the general store, they'd laugh harder than before. Crazy veteran moved underground, living like a mole. PTSD finally made him crack. Luke leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The weight of it pressed on him like cold stone. He'd fought hard to rebuild his life quietly, away from noise, away from the things that made his pulse spike and his breath hitch. The last thing he needed was the town labeling him unstable. He trusted Ranger more than he trusted most people. A faint knock of wind rattled the barn siding above him. The cold was coming, and when winter swept across Montana, it came in furious waves. He remembered nights overseas, when cold cut through layers of gear, when frostbite stalked exposed skin, when men huddled in cramped shelters, wishing for anything warmer than the metal and sand around them. He wouldn't relive that. Not here. Not with Ranger. Luke stood slowly, turning in a full circle to take in the room with new eyes. Not as a mystery, but as a plan. "We can make this work," he said quietly. Ranger answered by pawing at the barn floor above him, nails tapping against the boards like a signal of approval. Luke climbed out of the opening and stood up, brushing dirt from his jeans. The light from the barn's single hanging bulb flickered as the wind picked up again, strong enough to make the walls creak. Outside, the sky had shifted into a deeper gray, the kind that promised an early freeze, maybe even a dusting of snow before Halloween. Luke shivered and zipped his coat higher. He looked from the barn to the house, then back again. He remembered Evan's mocking laughter at the store, remembered the other men watching with amusement. Small town, big mouths. They always meant well until they didn't. Luke exhaled hard and said the words out loud, anchoring them in the cold air. "We keep it secret." Ranger stepped forward, nudging his hand with a soft snort, sealing the agreement like a second signature. Luke crouched and rested his forehead against Ranger's forehead for a moment. "Just until we're sure it works. Just until I know it'll keep us alive." The dog licked his cheek gently. The same reassurance Ranger gave him before missions long ago. Luke stood again, a sense of purpose settling in his chest. Not the frantic, adrenaline-laced urgency he'd known in combat, but a steady, grounded determination, something he hadn't felt in years. He walked back into the barn, closed the doors behind him, and began gathering tools, reinforcing beams, improving the stove vent, adding insulation, strengthening the ladder, preparing the dugout for the winter storm he knew was coming. Ranger lay at the edge of the opening, keeping watch like an old guardian of a new secret. Luke paused and looked at the dog. "Let the neighbors laugh," he said softly. "When the cold comes knocking, we'll be ready." The lantern flickered beneath the barn floor as Luke descended once more, and the hidden room welcomed him with its silent promise. Warmth, safety, and a second chance to survive a season that had broken stronger men than him. Above them, the wind pushed harder against the timber walls, announcing the first true breath of winter. Luke stood in the center of the dugout, lantern casting long shadows across the earth-packed walls. The air was still, so still that he could hear his own breath echo softly. It was strange how a place so small, so buried, could feel like a refuge, calmer than the wide-open world above. But Luke knew better than to trust first impressions. Safety wasn't real unless it was reinforced. He wouldn't gamble Ranger's life or his own on wishful thinking. He set the lantern on the floor and pulled off his gloves, rubbing his hands together to warm them. The beam of the lantern revealed the imperfections he hadn't noticed before. Tiny gaps in the sod bricks, hairline cracks in a couple of the ceiling beams, and spots in the ventilation pipe where cold air seeped through. Winter would find every weakness. He'd learned that overseas. The elements were as ruthless as any enemy. Luke climbed back up and returned with tools. A hammer, a handsaw, 2 replacement beams he'd salvaged from the barn's rafters, and a roll of heavy canvas he'd picked up years ago for repairs. Ranger watched from above, tail sweeping the floorboard slowly, as if assessing every movement. "All right, buddy," Luke said, lowering himself again. "Let's make this place stronger." He began with the ceiling beams, reinforcing each one the way he'd been taught to secure temporary shelters during cold weather operations. He worked in silence, except for the soft, rhythmic tap of the hammer and the occasional creak of settling wood. Dust sprinkled down from the barn above, drifting like pale snowflakes across the lantern's glow. Ranger barked once when Luke's hammer struck a little too hard, the sound echoing sharply. "I'm okay," Luke called up. "Promise." The reassurance didn't soothe the dog entirely. Ranger stood guard at the edge of the opening, head lowered, eyes never leaving Luke. Loyalty like that was a rare thing. Luke felt it deep in his bones every time he met the dog's gaze in the darkest moments overseas. Ranger had been the only steady presence beside him. And now, in a Montana winter that threatened more than just discomfort, that bond mattered more than ever. Luke moved next to the walls, filling gaps with packed dirt and clay scraped from the dry corners of the dugout. His breath fogged the air as he worked, and sweat formed on his brow despite the cold. Hours passed quietly, the world above slipping into night. Each improvement made the room feel less like a forgotten relic and more like a deliberate refuge. When he stepped back to survey the work, he felt a flicker of confidence, small but real. "That's better," he said under his breath. He turned toward the ventilation pipe, brushing dirt from the metal surface. It was solid, but old. The joints needed sealing. He wrapped sections in canvas and secured them with wire, testing each connection. Ranger barked again, short and sharp. "What now?" Luke muttered. He climbed the ladder and emerged into the barn. Ranger was limping. Hey, what happened?" Luke knelt beside him, heart tightening with sudden panic. Ranger's back paw was scraped, a small cut bleeding through his fur. The dog whined softly, pressing his head against Luke's shoulder in apology, as if he'd done something wrong. Luke sighed, relief washing over him. "You big knucklehead," he murmured, checking the paw carefully. "You hurt yourself on that loose board?" He gathered Ranger gently, carrying him toward the stack of old blankets in the barn corner. The dog was heavier than he remembered, years of muscle from training and running beside him. But Luke didn't mind the weight. He sat on the hay bale and held Ranger's paw in his hands. The wound was shallow but looked painful. Luke cleaned it with warm water from a thermos and tied a strip of cloth around it. Ranger let out a quiet huff, leaning into Luke's chest. Memories rose unbidden. Dusty nights when Ranger saved him from tripwires, the boyish grin of a fellow soldier who didn't make it home. A moment Luke had spent years trying not to relive. These flashes never came gently. They struck like a cold wind, knifing through winter coats. Luke pushed them back, focusing on Ranger's steady breathing. "You've always had my back," he whispered. "Even when I didn't have my own?" Ranger nudged his chin, understanding the emotion, even without the words. Luke let the moment settle, then straightened. "We're okay, and we'll make this place okay too." He returned to work. Ranger rested nearby, eyes half closed, but still alert. Luke moved with a quiet urgency now, driven not only by survival, but by responsibility to the dog who trusted him with everything. He patched the ladder, reinforced the frame of the opening, and disguised the trap door with fresh hay from the loft. From above, no one would ever suspect a hidden chamber was beneath their feet. By the time he finished, night had swallowed the barn, the lantern below, the only glow in the darkness. Luke knelt beside Ranger and stroked his fur. "That's it for today," he murmured. "Tomorrow, we make it livable." He let his hand rest on the dog's side, feeling the steady rise and fall of Ranger's breath. Outside, the wind howled like a warning carried across the mountains, rattling the barn doors. Luke looked toward the sound, jaw tightening. Winter was coming fast, and from now on he and Ranger would be meeting it underground, alone, silent, and determined. The next few days passed in a blur of work. Luke rose with the pale Montana sun, breathed in the air so cold it felt sharp in his lungs, and made his way straight to the barn. Ranger limped beside him, but refused to stay inside the cabin, determined to guard every moment of the project he considered a mission. Luke admired that stubborn loyalty. He saw himself in it more than he liked to admit. Morning frost spread across the fields like a thin sheet of glass. The sky carried that washed-out blue that warned of the first snow. Luke could taste the change coming. He pushed harder, reinforcing the dugout walls, hauling blankets, old chairs, and supplies down under the floor when the neighbors weren't around. In the evenings, he walked the property line with Ranger at his side, making sure no eyes were watching. But he soon realized eyes were watching. On the fourth evening, just as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods, Ranger stiffened. His ears snapped forward. His entire body leaned toward the far end of the barn, toward the dirt road leading in from town. Luke followed the dog's gaze. A shape stood there, tall, broad, too still to be a wanderer, too calculating to be lost. Evan Mills. He wasn't on Luke's property exactly, but close enough to see the barn, close enough to wonder why Luke spent every evening pacing around it, disappearing inside for hours. Luke kept his voice low. "Let him pass, Ranger." Ranger obeyed, but his growl vibrated low, deep, and unmistakably protective. Evan lifted a hand lazily in a mock wave, then cupped his hands around his mouth. "Evening. Harrison, you fixing to move into that barn? You're in there more than your own house." Luke forced a nod. "Casual but controlled. Got repairs to make before winter." Evan chuckled and turned away, muttering something Luke couldn't quite hear. Snow crunched under his boots as he walked. Ranger didn't move until Evan disappeared down the road. Luke took a slow breath through his nose. That was too close. He spent the next morning covering the trapdoor with 2 layers of fresh hay, scattering it with the wide, sweeping movements of a man tired of being watched. He even dragged an old wheelbarrow over the area to mask any footprints around the opening. Still, Ranger seemed uneasy. Whenever Luke climbed down, Ranger stood above the trapdoor and stared at the barn door, as if expecting someone to barge in. Late one afternoon, while Luke was fitting insulation behind the stove, Ranger barked, a single sharp alert sound, not fearful, not frantic, a warning. Luke froze. Every nerve in his body went still the way they had during patrols overseas. He set the lantern on the floor, climbed the ladder silently, and eased himself through the trapdoor opening. Ranger was standing rigid, head turned toward the window slats high on the barn wall. His gaze was locked like a laser on something outside. Luke approached the wall, pushed aside a thin strip of old wood, and peered out. There he was, Evan Mills, standing behind his pickup truck. Engine off, lights off, just watching the barn, watching Luke's routine, watching for an answer to the question building in his mind. A knot formed in Luke's stomach, squeezing tighter with every breath. Ranger bared his teeth in a silent snarl. Luke leaned closer, whispering, "Easy, don't give us away." But Evan wasn't stupid. He knew the signs of secrecy when he saw them. He'd watched Luke carry things toward the barn instead of the house, watched him buy far less firewood than anyone else, watched him pacing the yard with the tense posture of a man hiding something. And people like Evan didn't let go once they convinced themselves a mystery was brewing. Luke stepped away from the window and leaned against the beam, breath heavy. Ranger came to his side, nudging his hand with a soft, anxious sound. "I know," Luke whispered. "He's getting too curious." A memory washed over him. Dusty alleys overseas. A civilian whose innocent questions turned out not to be so innocent. The way suspicion once lit spread like fire. He swallowed hard, pushing the tension down. He had promised himself he wouldn't let the past control him. But sometimes the past walked right up the road in a flannel jacket and stared through your barn walls. Hours later, when Luke dared to look again, Evan's truck was gone. But the uneasiness lingered. Ranger refused to leave Luke's side that night. Even inside the cabin, the dog paced by the door, staring out at the dark like he was tracking a scent Luke couldn't smell. Luke sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his temples. "He's going to keep poking around," he muttered. Ranger let out a low whine and rested his head on Luke's thigh. Luke stroked his fur gently. "We can't let him find the dugout. Not yet. If he does, everything we've worked for goes up in smoke." The next day, Luke doubled down on secrecy. He moved supplies only at dawn or dusk. He shoveled fresh snow around the barn door to hide footprints. He trained Ranger to stand guard at the back of the barn while he worked underground. But even as they tried to protect the secret, winter pressed closer. The air grew sharper, the wind whispered louder, and each night brought frost that crawled further across the fields. Secrecy was becoming harder. Suspicion was becoming thicker, and Evan's shadow lingered just out of sight. One evening, as Luke climbed from the dugout and brushed the hay over the trapdoor, Ranger stepped forward suddenly, growling under his breath. Luke spun around. A silhouette stood in the falling dusk, motionless, only 20 yards from the barn. Not Evan this time, another neighbor watching, waiting. Luke's heartbeat thudded in his ears. People were starting to talk, starting to wonder, starting to notice. He tightened his grip on Ranger's harness. From here on out, one wrong move could expose everything, and winter was only days away. The first snow didn't arrive gently. It came in a wall of white that swept across the valley like a beast awakened too early. One moment the ground was bare and brown. The next it was buried under an inch of blowing powder. The wind roared down from the mountains with a force that rattled every loose board on Luke's property. By dawn, the radio crackled with updates about an Arctic blast rolling in. The coldest front in nearly 20 years, the announcer warned. Temperature projections dropped with every hour. -10, -15, -20. People rushed into town for supplies. Chainsaws buzzed. Firewood disappeared from racks faster than the clerk could restock. Trucks hauled hay, propane, blankets, whatever could be carried. Luke didn't go to town, because he couldn't. Because if he showed up again with only a tiny amount of wood, someone would finally follow him home. Instead, he stood on his porch with arms crossed, watching the storm build in the west like a gray curtain pulling toward him. Ranger pressed against his leg, tail stiff, eyes sharp as he studied the sky with instincts older than civilization. "You feel it, too," Luke murmured. A gust of wind struck hard, lifting snow off the roof and swirling it across the yard. The world seemed to exhale in one long, icy breath. By late afternoon, the temperature plunged so fast it felt like the air had weight. Luke's breath came out in thick clouds. Ranger paced in circles, restless. The cold bit at Luke's fingertips through his gloves. He knew what that meant. "Ranger," he said quietly, "it's time." They hurried toward the barn, boots and paws crunching through the fresh snow. The wind slammed the barn door open as soon as Luke pulled it, and he fought to close it behind them. The inside was dim, the air already much colder than usual. Ranger shook himself, sending flecks of snow scattering. Luke swept the hay aside, lifted the trap door, and lowered the lantern first. Its glow illuminated the dugout below, and warmth, imagined warmth, hopeful warmth, seemed to radiate upward even before they descended. He climbed down carefully. Ranger waited above until Luke reached the floor, then leaped in with surprising grace for a dog his size. Luke closed the trap door, layering fresh hay on top. Down here, the storm's roar softened into a deep, distant hum. The thick sod walls held the earth's natural insulation, muting the world outside. Luke knelt beside the stove and opened its small firebox door. He fed it a modest handful of wood from the bundle he'd hidden in the corner. The flames caught quickly, orange and lively, reflecting in Ranger's eyes as he settled nearby. As warmth began to push back the chill, Luke finally exhaled. "Good, that's good." But relief didn't last long. A sudden crack echoed from somewhere above, followed by the heavy thud of snow collapsing from the barn roof. Ranger jumped to his feet, barking sharply. Luke steadied him, whispering reassurance. "We're safe. It's just the storm." He hoped that was true. Hours passed. The temperature inside the dugout rose steadily. 45 degrees, then 50, then nearly 57. Luke shed his coat and sat on the old crate, hands outstretched toward the stove. Ranger curled at his feet, drifting into a warm, peaceful doze. But above them, the world was suffering. Through the vent pipe, Luke heard faint, distant noises. Doors slamming, cattle bawling, the groan of frozen wood contracting under extreme cold. Every so often the wind howled with a pitch so sharp it cut through the dugout walls like a blade. Luke thought of Evan's children. Thought of the elderly couple. 2 farms over. Thought of the Jacobs family whose chimney had cracked last winter during a smaller storm than this. He thought of the soldiers he'd huddled with overseas, sharing heat, sharing hope, sharing fear, how silence had always carried the worst possibilities. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching, sensing Luke's unease. "You're right," Luke whispered. "There's nothing we can do." Not yet. He tried to sleep, but memories crept in. Memories of cold nights, in mountains, far from here. Nights when the wrong decision meant everything froze. Nights when the wind wasn't just a storm, but an enemy. Ranger nudged his arm each time Luke's breathing faltered from an echo of the past. By morning, the temperature outside had dropped to -25. Inside the house, Luke knew ice would be forming on the windows. Inside every other home in the valley, fires burned dangerously hot just to keep people alive. Luke fed the stove again and warmed up water before it froze in the container. Ranger sat close enough to feel the heat, but remained alert, ears turning toward the ceiling every time the storm shifted. Around noon, Luke climbed the ladder, opened the trap door, a crack, and let the cold air burn his face. The barn was dark, nearly unrecognizable. Snow pressed hard against the walls, wind howling through every seam. He closed the door and fastened it again. "We're riding it out down here," he said to Ranger. "It's the only way." Hours dragged by. The storm refused to weaken. Ranger dozed, woke, paced, and dozed again. Luke kept the fire alive with careful, constant attention. He was proud of the dugout, proud of how warm it stayed, proud of how little fuel it used. But he wasn't proud of the nagging feeling inside him, the one whispering that others above ground were freezing. As night settled again, the wind outside reached a pitch that made Luke stop mid-motion. He stared upward, listening. Something had changed in that howl. Something sharper. Something that wasn't just weather. Ranger stood suddenly, fur bristling. Then 3 faint knocks, barely audible, but unmistakable. Luke's blood froze. Someone was outside. Someone who wasn't supposed to know anyone was down here. Someone desperate enough to walk through a -30 blizzard. He and Ranger locked eyes. The storm had driven someone to his barn, and the secret he fought so hard to protect was about to face its first test. The knock came again. 3 soft raps carried through layers of earth and timber. Luke froze beside the stove, breath caught in his chest. Ranger's ears snapped forward, his entire body tight as a drawn bowstring. A low growl vibrated through him, not of aggression, but of warning. Someone was out there in -30 degrees wind at the barn door, knocking. Luke glanced upward, eyes locked on the trap door. Snow hammered against the barn roof, the wind howling like a living thing. Whoever knocked must have been desperate. More desperate than pride, fear, or common sense. Ranger whined softly and nudged Luke's leg, urging him to move. "I hear it," Luke whispered. He set the stove poker aside and climbed the ladder, each rung cold under his hands. Ranger stayed below, watching him with intense focus. When Luke pushed up on the trap door, a gust of icy air slapped him across the face, stealing his breath. The barn was dark, except for the faint moonlight filtering through the boards. Snow blew through cracks in swirling patterns, and every nail, every beam creaked under the weight of frost. The knocking came again, this time a little stronger, trembling with cold or fear. Luke crossed the barn floor in 3 long steps, boots crunching over the thin layer of snow that had slipped in. He paused at the door, listening, heart pounding hard. "Who is it?" he called out. A choked voice answered, hoarse and shaking, barely audible over the wind. "Luke, it's Evan." Luke's gut tightened. Evan Mills, the same Evan who mocked him at the general store. The same Evan who'd been snooping around the barn, watching, judging, assuming the worst. Now he was outside in a storm that could kill a man in minutes. Luke unlatched the door and pulled it open. Snow burst inward like a living wave, coating the floor and stinging his face. In the blinding white stood Evan, hat gone, scarf frozen stiff around his neck, face pale except for windburn on his cheeks. His hands trembled uncontrollably inside thin gloves, and his breath came out in painful gasps. Behind him, a dark shape hunched in the snow. A child. Luke stepped forward immediately, gripping Evan by the arm and hauling him inside. The boy stumbled in after him, clinging to Evan's coat. He wasn't more than 7. His lips were turning blue. "What happened?" Luke demanded. Evan leaned against a beam, trying to steady himself. Furnace gave out. Power's gone. Firewood's almost gone. He shook violently. "My boy got cold too fast. I walked him toward your barn. I saw a light and thought maybe someone was here." Luke stared at him in disbelief. "You walked all the way here in this?" Evan tried to nod, but shuddered instead. Didn't know what else to do. Ranger rushed to the boy first, sniffing him urgently, then nudging him toward Luke. The boy wrapped his arms around the dog's thick fur, trying to soak in his warmth. Luke's mind spun. The storm was worsening by the minute. Evan could barely stand. The boy might already be in mild hypothermia. And the house, their house, was a quarter-mile away. In whiteout conditions, they couldn't survive alone. There was only one place warm enough. Luke clenched his jaw. The secret. The dugout. He'd promised himself he wouldn't reveal it until he knew it worked. But this wasn't about secrecy anymore. He made his decision. "Follow me," Luke ordered, grabbing the lantern. Evan stared at him. "Where?" "The barn's freezing." Luke didn't answer. He knelt beside the old hay pile, shoved it aside, and lifted the trap door. Warm light spilled upward, illuminating the fear and confusion on Evan's face. "What? What is that?" Evan asked, eyes wide. "Your best chance," Luke said. "Come on, bring the boy." Luke descended the ladder with the lantern. Ranger stayed at the top until the child stepped forward, then guided him gently toward the opening. The boy clutched Ranger's neck, trusting the dog more than the storm. Evan followed, one trembling step at a time. When Evan reached the bottom, he stared around the dugout, disbelief mixing with exhaustion. "You've been living down here?" "Staying warm," Luke answered. "That's all." Luke helped the boy sit beside the stove, wrapped him in 2 blankets, and checked his fingers and ears for frostbite. Ranger curled around him, offering the kind of warmth no heater could match. The boy pressed his face into Ranger's fur, breathing easier. Luke handed Evan a blanket and guided him toward the stove. "Sit. Slow breaths. Warm up gradually." Evan dropped onto the old crate, shaking hard. His eyes darted around the room. The stove, the walls, the supplies, the smooth earthen ceiling. "I thought you were hiding something dangerous," he admitted, voice trembling. "I didn't think it was this." Luke didn't respond. He tossed another small piece of wood into the stove. Heat expanded through the room, gentle but undeniable. Evan looked up, guilt in his eyes. "I shouldn't have judged you or followed you. His voice cracked. "I didn't want my kids to freeze." Luke paused, the weight of that sentence hitting him. The storm howled again above them, a violent, feral roar that shook the beams. The dugout held firm. Evan whispered, "How did you find this?" "Ranger found it," Luke replied. The dog lifted his head, ears flicking at the mention of his name. Evan stared at the dog, amazed. "Smart animal." "The smartest," Luke said softly. Minutes passed. The storm raged. The dugout stayed warm. The boy whispered, "Mr. Harrison, are we going to be okay?" Luke knelt beside him, met his frightened eyes, and said, "Yeah, you're safe now." Ranger pressed close against the child, sealing the promise. For the first time since the storm began, Luke let himself breathe. The secret was out, but it had saved lives. And maybe, just maybe, this was the way it was always meant to happen. For a long minute, no one spoke. The only sound in the dugout was the crackling of the small iron stove, its flame painting soft gold across the packed earth walls. Outside, the storm screamed against the barn roof, trying to claw its way inside. But the dugout held strong, warm, steady, untouched by the chaos above. Ranger lay against the boy, lending him warmth the way only a dog could. His body curled protectively around the child's side. The boy's trembling had slowed, his breathing evened. The color was returning to his cheeks. Evan watched all of it with wide, exhausted eyes, his breath still shaking, but not as violently as before. The storm had battered him, stripped his pride, and left him vulnerable enough to finally see what Luke had been hiding. He looked up at Luke, voice raw. What is this place?" Luke didn't answer right away. He took the kettle he'd filled earlier and set it on top of the stove. The faint sizzle of heating metal broke the silence. The dugout felt smaller now with 3 people and a dog inside, but it didn't feel cramped. It felt protected. "This room's been here a long time," Luke began quietly. "Years before I bought this place, maybe decades." Evan ran his hand along the nearest wall, fingers tracing the smooth, compacted earth. "It's solid, warm, warmer than most houses right now." "That's the idea," Luke replied. "How'd you find it?" Luke glanced at Ranger. "He did. The dog flicked an ear at the mention of his name, but didn't move from his guard post beside the boy. Evan shook his head slowly. I thought you were losing it, Harrison. I thought you were hiding something illegal, or worse. His voice dimmed in shame. I followed you because I didn't understand. Luke studied him, watching the shift in his expression, fear fading into gratitude, suspicion collapsing under the weight of reality. The kettle began to steam. Luke poured warm water into a metal cup, then mixed in powdered broth before handing it to Evan. Drink slowly. Evan wrapped shaking fingers around the cup and sipped. He let out a breath he'd been holding for too long. Luke, I'm sorry. He swallowed hard. For laughing, for watching you, for thinking you were broken. Luke didn't flinch. He'd heard worse from people he trusted more. But something inside him softened, not toward Evan's words, but toward what they represented. Desperation had stripped Evan down to honesty. It's all right, Luke said. You were scared. Everyone's scared in storms like this. Evan nodded, eyelids heavy, but alert. But how long have you been using this? Why didn't you tell anyone? Luke took a slow breath. Because I didn't know if it would work. I needed to test it to be sure. He rested a hand on the stove. People out there don't listen unless they see something with their own eyes. And if I'd told the whole town right after finding it, what do you think they'd have done? Evan didn't hesitate. Laughed. Luke nodded. Exactly. Same way they laughed today. Same way they laughed when I bought hardly any wood. Evan looked away, ashamed again. Luke leaned back, his voice quieter now. When you've lived the things I've lived, you get cautious about what you share. Some things you keep quiet until you know they're real, until you know they'll help. Evan swallowed thickly. It helped tonight. Luke nodded, eyes drifting toward the boy who was now dozing against Ranger's warm fur. That's what matters. Evan stared around the room again at the stove, the beams, the tiny vent that carried smoke through the barn wall unnoticed. This place. It's genius. I didn't build it, Luke said. Someone before me did. Someone who knew how to survive the cold. Whoever they were, they saved my family tonight, Evan whispered. The storm above crashed violently, shaking loose snow from the rafters. The dugout didn't move. Evan's eyes widened as he finally understood something deeper. How warm does it stay? For real? Luke lifted the old thermometer he'd hung near the stove. The needle hovered near 58 degrees. With this stove, a handful of wood lasts hours, maybe more. Evan exhaled long and slow. My wife and kids, they've been wearing jackets inside the house since November. We've been burning everything we can find. Still cold. That's why I kept it quiet, Luke said. I needed to know it could keep someone through a real storm. Evan looked up sharply. It's doing more than that. It's saving us. Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. Minutes passed. The boy murmured something into Ranger's fur. The dog pressed even closer, eyes soft, guarding him with all the weight of his training and all the love he carried for Luke. Evan finally whispered, Luke, can I ask you something? Sure. You gonna tell anyone else about this? Luke didn't answer right away. He stared into the stove's glow, watching the small flame dance. He had been ready to protect the secret for months. Years, if he had to. But looking at Evan's son, remembering nights overseas when shelter meant life or death, something shifted in him. If this winter keeps up, Luke said slowly, I might not have a choice. Evan nodded, relief in his eyes. Good, because some folks out there, they won't make it through many more nights like this. Luke looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, Evan didn't look like a man judging him from afar. He looked like a neighbor, like a father terrified for his children, like someone Luke could finally understand. Evan swallowed again, emotion thickening his voice. Luke, thank you for taking us in, for saving my boy. Luke shook his head. Thank Ranger. He's the one who heard you first. Evan turned to the dog and gave him a long, grateful stare. Then thank you, Ranger. Ranger thumped his tail once solemnly, like he accepted the responsibility. Luke leaned back against the earthen wall. He felt something shift in his chest. Not just relief, but purpose. He didn't just survive tonight. He helped someone else survive it too. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like the soldier he used to be. Someone who protected others. Someone who made things better. Above them, the storm raged on. But down here, truth had finally been revealed. and that truth would soon ripple far beyond this small hidden room. The storm raged through the night with a violence neither man nor beast could ignore. Luke barely slept, checking the stove every hour, feeding it small pieces of wood, watching the flame rise and fall like the faint heartbeat of their survival. Ranger stayed awake longer than either of them, ears twitching at every blast of wind overhead, his eyes reflecting the firelight like two amber beacons. By dawn, the wind still screamed, angry and relentless. Snow piled against the barn walls so thickly that the vent pipe above them groaned under the weight of the drifts pushing in. The dugout stayed warm, 60 degrees now, but the world outside was frozen solid. Evan stirred on the crate, groaning as he sat up. His son slept curled beside Ranger, the dog's chin draped protectively over the boy's shoulder. Luke watched the scene quietly, a knot forming in his throat he didn't expect. Something about the way Ranger guarded the child, steady, gentle, selfless, struck deeper than words could reach. Evan rubbed his eyes. "How long was I out?" "Most of the night," Luke said. "Storm didn't let up." Evan nodded, still taking in the room with awe. "Feels like we're in another world down here." Before Luke could reply, a faint sound drifted from above, muffled but unmistakable. Another knock. Evan stiffened. Someone else? Luke climbed the ladder halfway and cracked the trap door just enough to listen. Ranger rose instantly, body tense, head tilted upward. The knock came again, harder, more frantic. Then a voice. Thin. Desperate. "Hello? Anyone inside? Please help." Luke's pulse spiked. That wasn't a man's voice. It was a woman. He shoved the trapdoor open and climbed into the barn. Frost blew in through every seam. The cold hit him like a punch. He crossed the barn in seconds and pulled the door open against the wind. 3 figures stumbled in. Evan's wife, Karen, their teenage daughter, Emily, and their youngest boy, wrapped in 2 blankets but still shaking violently. Karen's face was nearly white, her eyelashes frosted. Emily clutched her little brother, eyes red from windburn. The youngest sobbed into her side, trying and failing to breathe evenly. Luke grabbed Karen's arm. Inside, now. The 3 hurried in, snow swirling around them like angry spirits. Luke slammed the door shut and latched it. Karen collapsed against a beam, breath shuddering. The house had got too cold. The fire wouldn't stay lit. I couldn't. Her voice broke with fear. I didn't know where else to go. Emily's teeth chattered. Dad said he'd check on Mr. Harrison. When he didn't come back, we thought Luke didn't let her finish. He's safe. He's downstairs. He opened the trapdoor. Warm air rose up like a blessing. Ranger barked from below, urging them down. Karen saw the glowing light beneath the floor and gasped. "What is that?" "Your shelter," Luke said. "Hurry." Ranger climbed up 2 rungs to help guide the youngest child down, nudging him onto the ladder with gentle pressure. Luke helped Karen descend while Emily followed, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. When they reached the bottom, Evan stood, eyes wide as he saw his family. Karen, Emily. God, what happened? Karen threw her arms around him, sobbing into his chest. "We almost didn't make it." Evan held her tightly, then looked at Luke with tears in his eyes. Thank you for opening that door." Luke nodded, throat tight, but it wasn't over yet. As they settled, Ranger walked between the children, checking each one, nose to their cheeks, ensuring none were in danger. He lay down, letting the youngest boy curl against him, wrapping himself around them like a living blanket. The teenager leaned her back against the dog too, grateful for the warmth. Evan shook his head in disbelief. 10 people could live down here, he murmured. Luke corrected him with a small smile. "Maybe not 10, but for now we can keep everyone warm." Karen looked around slowly. "It's incredible down here. Warm, solid, safe." Luke crouched by the stove, feeding it another small block of wood. It doesn't take much to heat. That's the point. The room was suddenly filled with hushed voices, relieved, emotional, disbelieving. For a moment, the dugout transformed from a hiding place into a sanctuary. But as warmth seeped into cold-numbed fingers and toes, another feeling grew too. Hope. Karen wiped her eyes. "Luke, how long does it stay this warm?" "As long as I feed the stove." he said. And we don't waste wood. She nodded, tears threatening again. Thank you for saving my children. Luke sat back, staring into the stove's fire. He'd saved soldiers before. He'd protected strangers overseas, but saving a neighbor's family in a Montana blizzard that felt different, closer, more human. Evan sat beside him quietly. Luke, we owe you everything. Luke didn't respond. Instead, he looked at Ranger, who lay stretched across the dirt floor. Kids wrapped around him like fallen leaves around a warm stone. That dog, Evan whispered, might be the reason we're still breathing. He is, Luke said. Time passed. The storm above softened just slightly, not enough to travel, but enough to hear the difference in its song. Emily leaned against the wall, wrapped in a blanket, watching Luke with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Mr. Harrison, did you build this? No, Luke said. Someone before me did. I just fixed it, and you kept it secret? She asked softly. Luke hesitated, then nodded. Until now. Emily nodded slowly. Thank you for not keeping it secret tonight. Luke lowered his gaze. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. Not when people need them. Evan placed a hand on Luke's shoulder, firm, grateful. You helped us when it counted. I won't forget that. Luke swallowed hard. Just keep your family warm. That's all that matters. The room fell into a long, peaceful silence, the kind that only comes after fear releases its grip. The children slept. Karen leaned against Evan's shoulder. Emily watched Ranger breathe. And Luke sat beside the stove, warming his hands, feeling the weight of the moment settled deep inside him. The dugout had saved a family tonight. Tomorrow it might need to save more. And Luke knew exactly what that meant. The secret wasn't just out. It was alive now, moving from one set of eyes to the next, growing, spreading, waiting for the moment when the whole valley would need it. For now, though, 6 people and 1 loyal dog breathed warm air in the 10 by 8 foot room while the storm outside clawed at the world. And Luke Harrison, once a lonely veteran with a hidden shelter, had become something else entirely, a lifeline. By the time the storm began to lose its fury, the dugout had become more than a shelter. It had turned into a small beating heart of warmth beneath a world frozen stiff. The stove crackled gently. The children slept in a huddle beside Ranger, his warm body draped across them like a living blanket. Evan and Karen leaned against the wall, heads touching, exhausted tears dried on their cheeks. Emily dozed with her hand resting on Ranger's back, trusting him the way people trust things that have saved their lives. Luke remained awake the longest. He sat near the stove, elbows on his knees, staring into the flame with a quiet stillness. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't trapped in old memories. It wasn't wrestling with shadows or ghosts. It wasn't replaying things he wished he'd forget. It was here, rooted in purpose. Outside, the storm screamed less violently. Its voice cracked, then faded into heavy moans. Snow still pressed against the barn walls in deep drifts, but the wind had weakened from a savage howl to a tired groan. By late morning, the cold remained brutal, but survivable. The thermometer in the dugout stayed steady at 58 degrees. Luke poured warm water into tin cups and passed them around as the family slowly woke. Evan rubbed his frozen hands together, staring in disbelief at the steam rising from his cup. I still don't understand how this works. Luke pointed to the walls. Earth insulates better than wood, better than brick in storms like this. Whoever dug this out knew exactly what they were doing. Karen shook her head. It feels impossible. Like we're under the eye of a hurricane but sitting by a campfire. Emily exhaled a shaky breath. Feels like a miracle. Ranger wagged his tail once, sensing the shift in mood. Luke stood and stretched. Storm's dying. When it settles, we'll go up. But they didn't climb up yet. Not until the blizzard stopped clawing at the outer walls. Not until the wind finally gave one last sigh and drifted into silence. When Luke opened the trapdoors later, a rush of cold air hit him like a wall. He climbed out, boots sinking into snow almost up to his knees. The barn was half buried. The windows frosted over. Every beam groaned under the frozen weight. Ranger squeezed through beside him, instantly scanning the yard, nose deep in the snow. His breath blew out in white clouds. Luke turned and offered his hand to help the family climb up. They emerged, blinking into the harsh light. "Stay close," Luke warned. He pushed the barn doors open. A sheet of snow fell inward, thick and heavy. A mountain of white greeted them, level with the barn roof in some places. The world was unrecognizable, transformed into a frozen desert. Karen gasped. "Oh, my lord," Evan whispered. "We would have died last night." Luke didn't argue. The truth was carved into the ice itself. As they trudged from the barn toward the house, Luke helped carve a narrow path with his boots. Ranger bounded ahead, making tunnels in the snow for the kids. The cold bit at their cheeks, but no longer felt like death breathing down their necks. At the Mills house, the windows were layered in frost inside and out. The front door groaned when Evan forced it open. The air inside was colder than the barn, colder even than the outdoors. Emily's teeth chattered. "We lived in this." Luke didn't speak. He stepped inside and inspected the furnace. It was frozen solid, the firewood pile nearly gone. Evan hadn't been exaggerating. They'd been running on fumes. Karen held her youngest close. "We need to stay with Luke until this warms up." Evan nodded. Pride had frozen right along with everything else. Luke cleared his throat. "You're welcome to stay in the dugout until we fix this place up. We'll get through the rest of the cold snap first." Karen grabbed his hand, eyes glassy with gratitude. "Luke, thank you. You saved us." He didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded. By evening, the family returned to the dugout with Luke. Ranger trotted behind them, tail wagging with the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. The storm passed. The next day, word spread. The Mills family hadn't meant to talk, but when neighbors saw the damage to their furnace and asked how they survived the storm, the truth slipped out in pieces. A hidden room under Luke Harrison's barn, warm as a hearth, using a fraction of the wood. Suspicion turned to curiosity. Curiosity turned to amazement. Within 24 hours, 3 neighbors walked to Luke's property, trudging through knee-deep snow, hats pulled low, eyes squinting against the cold. Luke stepped out of the barn as they approached. Ranger stood at his side, a silent shadow. "Morning," Luke greeted. Luke, Mr. Garrison, the oldest rancher in the valley, cleared his throat. "We heard you got some kind of underground heater, something that saved the Mills family." Luke didn't answer. He waited. Mrs. Rogers stepped forward next. Worry etched into her wind-burned face. "Our firewood's half gone already. Furnace is acting up too. If this cold keeps up, we won't last 2 more nights." Another neighbor spoke. "We ain't asking for charity. We just want to see at what you built down there." Luke hesitated. Revealing the dugout meant losing the last bit of secrecy he had. It meant inviting questions, crowds, maybe even ridicule from those who didn't understand. But then Ranger nudged his legs softly just once. It was enough. Luke exhaled. "Come with me." He led them to the barn, swept aside the hay, and lifted the trap door. Warmth drifted upward instantly. The neighbors gasped. "What in the world? This is unbelievable. How did you find it?" Luke answered simply, "Ranger found it. I fixed it. You're welcome to look." They climbed down the ladder slowly, reverently, as though stepping into a place sacred, their faces lit with amazement at the temperature, the craftsmanship, the simplicity. Mr. Garrison shook his head. "This could save the whole valley. You understand that, son?" Luke looked at Ranger, loyal, watchful, proud, then at the neighbors, cold, tired, desperate. "Yes," he said, "I do." And for the first time in his life, Luke Harrison had something to offer that wasn't strength, wasn't fighting, wasn't sacrifice on a battlefield far from home. He had warmth, knowledge, and the will to share it. Ranger leaned against his leg again, sealing the moment. Luke finally smiled. "Let's get you all through the winter." Word traveled through the valley faster than the next storm. Families who had never spoken more than a polite nod to Luke now trudged up the snowy path to his barn. Boots caked in frost, breath fogging the air. They arrived with questions, with fear, with hope shining in tired eyes. And Luke, quiet, steady Luke, met each of them with the same answer. "Come on. I'll show you." Ranger led every group, padding across the barn floor with the calm assurance of a seasoned guide. When Luke lifted the trap door, Warmth rose from the earth, like a promise. People gasped, marveled, wiped their eyes as they descended into the 10 by 8-foot chamber that had once belonged only to Luke and Ranger. Now it belonged to everyone. The following weeks unfolded, like chapters in a book no one expected to write. Luke taught ranchers how to pack sod and earth, how to reinforce beams, how to disguise vent pipes so no snowdrift could choke them. He showed mothers how to bank a stove to hold heat through the night. He taught teenagers how to measure soil moisture and patch cracks in dugout walls. And every single day, Ranger stayed at his side, watching, guiding, warming, shivering hands with his fur, leaning against frightened children until they stopped trembling. One morning, Luke found Ranger standing proudly with a group of kids, shepherding them away from a weak patch of ground where they'd been trying to dig. Luke knelt, checked the soil, and realized Ranger had just prevented a small cave-in. "Heard something else, didn't you?" Luke whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. Winter deepened, temperatures sank lower than anyone remembered in decades, but no one in the valley froze. No one burned their last stick of furniture. No one watched the frost crawl across their walls and wondered if they'd see morning. Luke's dugout had changed everything. By late January, there were 7 new dugouts scattered across the valley, each built with Luke's guidance, each warmed by small stoves that used a fraction of normal fuel. Families gathered underground to share food, stories, and long breaths of relief. Luke stood inside each one before it opened for use, testing ventilation, checking walls, running his hands along the beams the way a soldier checks the integrity of a shelter in hostile terrain. Ranger inspected each dugout, too, nose twitching, ears alert for anything out of place. The valley had survived storms before, but not like this one, and never with this kind of unity. When February arrived, something extraordinary happened. People stopped talking about how cold the winter was, and started talking about how warm the valley felt. Luke didn't seek attention. He didn't stand in front of crowds or give speeches. He simply worked quietly and steadily, the way he'd survived every challenge life had thrown at him. But the valley saw, the valley knew, and the valley decided he deserved more than quiet gratitude. At the end of winter, when the first hints of spring softened the snowbanks, the entire community gathered in the town park, a patch of open ground surrounded by leafless aspens and snow-dusted benches. The sky glowed pale gold with sunset. Breaths fogged the air, but no one shivered. Luke arrived late, Ranger at his side, unsure why they'd been called. But when he stepped into the clearing, he stopped short. Everyone was there. The Mills family stood up front, bundled in coats, smiling through tears. Behind them, ranchers, shopkeepers, and families. Luke had helped all gathered around a small wooden platform built overnight. Evan stepped forward. "Luke, we wanted to thank you." Luke shook his head. "You don't have to." "We do," Karen said softly. "You saved us. All of us." The crowd murmured in agreement. Evan lifted a small wooden plaque carved from reclaimed barnwood. "We don't have medals here. We're not the military, but we wanted to give you this." He handed the plaque to Luke. It read Luke Harrison, "For generosity, courage, and the warmth that saved us." Luke swallowed hard. Words stuck in his throat. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of being seen, understood, appreciated. Ranger nudged his leg. Evan laughed softly. "And we didn't forget him." Karen stepped forward with a smaller plaque shaped like a dog's silhouette, sanded smooth, and fitted with a brass nameplate. It read, "Ranger for loyalty and bravery." The crowd erupted in warm applause. Children ran to Ranger, hugging him, petting him, thanking him. Ranger stood tall and proud, tail wagging slowly, as if accepting his role with quiet dignity. Luke blinked several times, trying to steady the rush of emotion swelling in his chest. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was belonging. Something he hadn't felt in years. The sheriff raised his voice. "Folks, I think we can all agree on one thing. This winter would have taken lives if not for Luke and that dog of his. From here on out, this valley stands because they stood for us." Applause rolled through the clearing like a warm wave. Luke bowed his head, overwhelmed. He looked at Ranger, who looked back with calm, amber eyes. The same eyes that had warned him, guided him, saved him time and again. Luke rested a hand on the dog's head. "Couldn't have done any of this without you," he whispered. Ranger leaned into him, accepting the praise with the same simple grace he always had. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow, the valley celebrated not just surviving winter, but surviving it together. Luke stood in the middle of them, Ranger at his side, warmth rising from the crowd like a bonfire. And for the first time in a long time, Luke didn't feel like the man escaping his past. He felt like the man building a future where warmth wasn't hidden beneath the floorboards, but shared with everyone who needed it. If you felt something in this story, drop a simple comment, even just 1 or 0, so I know you were here with us until the end. Your comment helps this channel grow, and it tells me you want more stories like this. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in our journey. More veterans, more loyal dogs, and more stories of courage, hope, and second chances. I'll see you in the next story.